So let's take a look at world systems theory. To understand world systems theory, we need to think about the histories of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. So late in the 15th century, Europeans began exploring already inhabited lands in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And Britain actually came to control 1/4 of the world's land. So you might have heard the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And this was actually, if you think about it, true at this point in time. That part of the British Empire, it was always day because they had so many places around the world. By 1921, the British Empire was trying to rule a population of between 470 and 570 million people, which at the time was 1/4 of the world's population. And these empires covered about 37 million square kilometers of the earth, which is almost 1/4 of the Earth's total land area. World systems theory also takes into account the history of the transatlantic slave trade, which began roughly around 1500 and continued until at least 1860. During this time, more than 15 million people were enslaved and transported from Western Africa to the Americas. And these trade routes were also transporting food and substances, as you can see here, like tobacco, coffee, cotton, sugar, and rice. And it's this historical context that's the background for world systems theory. So what is this world systems theory? World systems theory, it explains global inequality in terms of the historical exploitation of poor nations by rich ones. World systems theory argues that centuries of systemic impoverishment of poorer countries are still happening today. So economic relationships today continue these patterns of domination. This influence on global affairs is harder to see, but is just as influential as the more explicit colonialism, imperialism, and enslavement. So how is it that economic relationships today through trade continue patterns of domination? There's 3 ways. The first is the economic organization of poorer nations. So poorer nations tend to only produce a few crops. So Nigeria is known for producing oil, Malaysia for palm oil, some Latin American nations for coffee as well as fruit. And these are called cash crops. And cash crops are part of world systems theory because poorer nations often don't have the industrial capacity and infrastructure to manufacture the crops that they grow. So they tend to sell their raw produce to wealthier countries who then manufacture those goods. And then the poorer nations buy back the final product from the wealthier countries as a consumer good. And at this stage, it's more expensive because value has been added through the manufacturing process. And it's now a more expensive product with the surplus going to the wealthier country, even though the poorer country actually provided the raw material. And this creates a cycle or a double bind that's hard for poorer countries to break out of. And in some cases, this cycle has actually been cultivated. So think about the British colonists in India. Locals were allowed to grow, but not to weave cotton. So here we have a picture of cotton in the bottom right. The British shipped Indian raw cotton to their own textile mills in Birmingham and Manchester. And, they processed it, they turned it into beautiful fabrics and clothing, and then they sold it back to their colonies in India. And the group that maximized their profit from this relationship was the British colonizers. And it was a very fabricated, intentional situation. The third component is foreign debt. Collectively, the poorer nations of the world owe rich countries over $5 trillion. And such large debt actually paralyzes a country. It causes high unemployment, it can cause rampant inflation. And we can also question whether we can even use the word debt here. Is that an appropriate word? We'll problematize that a little bit. Together, poorer nations spend at least 300 billion annually in debt repayment. And much of this is high interest rates. So these countries aren't even paying off their principal, they are just paying off interest every month. And this is a misuse of funds that could be spent within these countries to support their education systems and their healthcare systems, which would benefit hundreds of millions of people. So Immanuel Wallerstein wrote in the 1980s that the perspective that the capitalist world economy is a global system divided into a hierarchy of three major types of nations: core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral, in which upward or downward mobility is conditioned by the resources and obstacles that characterize the international system. So this is pretty cool and was revolutionary in the 1980s when Wallerstein wrote about this. So he is seeing the world economy as one system that we need to think of holistically. So he says we can't understand the conditions of one particular nation without thinking about how it's situated in trade relationships and its political influence and those sorts of things. And then he's saying nations are shaped by their position in this system. But Wallerstein is saying that countries in relation to each other have social mobility. And he breaks this into core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations. Let's describe each category. So the core has industrialized capitalist countries that tend to be stable, democratic, relatively autonomous in terms of politics, and they control most wealth, technology, power, and resources globally. And their economies tend to be service-based and manufacturing-based. The periphery have little wealth or power, tend to be unstable, undemocratic, have been made to be dependent on the core for aid, and become sources of raw materials and cheap labor, which provides a market for the core. So in this transnational division of labor, the core uses the periphery as a source of affordable labor and raw materials for their transnational corporations that are owned by people who live in the core. And then when they extract those raw materials and use the cheap labor to manufacture them, they sell it back to the periphery as a high profit consumer good. That's one example of the transnational division of labor. So the periphery is a source of raw materials and cheap labor and provides a market to the core. But then we have these semi-periphery nations. And these are nations that are tricky to categorize because they're more developed than peripheral nations, but they're less developed than core nations. So some examples might be Brazil, and we've seen a huge shift in India's status in recent years. Now, there are some critiques of world systems theory. So the first is that, well, foreign trade has assisted some countries. So, for example, trade with wealthy countries has helped the economies of Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. So there are some exceptions. Second, foreign investment can stimulate growth. It doesn't always manufacture economic decline. But the pushback is that this growth is not experienced in the same way by all groups of people. Those who own the factories may benefit the local elite, but the average worker likely doesn't. And it usually involves environmental harm. And so there can be an environmental load offset to the poorer nations from the wealthier nations. And then three, the ability of countries to move into the core counters the claim that globalization will lead to increased poverty in the periphery. But a country having upward mobility, moving positions, tends to be the exception more than the rule. So it's like saying that because some people can change classes, there is no system of stratification. So there, in a nutshell, is world systems theory within the framework of political economy.
Now let's apply world systems theory to disasters, as some disaster scholars have done. The argument is that this world system shapes disaster vulnerability, with peripheral nations often in the most challenging position. Peripheral nations often face the highest exposure to environmental hazards like cyclones, droughts, and floods, while at the same time lacking the infrastructure, resources, and political clout to respond effectively. Their vulnerability is systemic, not incidental. World systems theory also explains why recovery is uneven at the national level. Core nations can mobilize resources quickly, while peripheral nations rely on international aid. This aid is often tied to political conditions or delivered through foreign contractors. This reinforces dependency and delays resilience. Colonialism continues to be embedded in this structure. The same regions that were exploited for sugar, cotton, and minerals are now sites of climate vulnerability and disaster exposure. The same racial and economic hierarchies that justified empire now shape global disaster risk. Let's look at just one example. Bangladesh offers a powerful example of world systems theory and disaster vulnerability. As a peripheral nation in the global economy, Bangladesh plays a key role in supplying cheap labor for the garment industry. Major brands like H&M, Zara, and Walmart have been known to source clothing from factories in Dhaka and other urban centers. Some of these factories have been built in low-lying, flood-prone areas with minimal safety standards. When cyclones do strike, the consequences are devastating. In 2007, Cyclone Sidr killed over 3,000 people and displaced millions. In 2020, Cyclone Amphan caused widespread damage to homes, infrastructure, and farmland. These disasters are not just meteorological, they're structural. They reveal how global economic arrangements shape local vulnerability. Workers in Bangladesh's garment sector earn some of the lowest wages in the world. Many live in informal settlements near their workplaces, with limited access to clean water, healthcare, or emergency services. When disaster hits, they are among the first affected and the last to recover. Again, their exposure is not random. It's built into the system. International supply chains exacerbate this vulnerability. Brands demand fast production and low costs, pressuring factory owners to cut corners. That means safety measures, flood protections, and evacuation plans are often neglected. The global north benefits from cheap clothing, while Bangladeshi workers bear the environmental and human risks. Recovery is also shaped by global hierarchies. International aid may arrive, but it's often channeled through NGOs or foreign contractors. Local communities have limited control over how resources are distributed. This reinforces dependency and delays long-term disaster resilience. Colonial legacies are visible here too. Bangladesh was part of British India, and its economy was reorganized around export commodities like jute and tea. Post-independence, it remained tied to global markets through low-wage manufacturing. The same extractive logic that shaped colonial rule now drives disaster vulnerability. World systems theory helps us connect these dots. It shows how global capitalism produces uneven risk and recovery. It reminds us that disasters are not just local, they are global phenomena rooted in historical and economic structures. Later, we'll talk about unequal ecological exchange theory. There, we'll shift our focus from labor and capital to environmental flows, how resources, waste, and pollution move across borders, and how colonialism continues to shape who pays the ecological price.